responding to you. They are responding to what you believe about yourself, and the terrifying part, the part that changes everything once you actually let it land, is that you have been broadcasting that belief your entire life without ever once opening your mouth to say it. Every room you have walked into, every handshake, every silence, every moment you hesitated before you spoke or shrank back from an opportunity or laughed a little too quickly at a joke that was aimed at you. Every single one of those moments was a transmission, a live signal going out into the world that told everyone paying attention exactly how much you thought you were worth. And the world, being the perfectly calibrated mirror that it is, gave you back precisely what you sent out. You have been shaping how people treat you with a story you tell yourself in private, and most of that story is not true. This is the truth that people who drift through life never learn, and people who command their lives never forget. That the single most powerful thing you can change about how the world responds to you is not your wardrobe, not your vocabulary, not your title, not your bank balance, not the car you drive or the circles you move in, or the credentials on your wall. It is the internal image you carry of who you are when no one is watching, because that image leaks out through everything, and people read it before you have said a single word. Robert Greene spent decades studying the psychology of power, human behavior, and what actually separates the people who move through the world with authority from the people who spend their lives apologizing for taking up space. In The Laws of Human Nature, published in 2018, after 6 years of research synthesizing evolutionary psychology, behavioral science, and centuries of historical biography, Greene arrived at a conclusion that most people find either liberating or devastating, depending on how ready they are to hear it. That people have a self-opinion, a deep, fiercely defended perception of their own character and worthiness, and that this self-opinion, accurate or not, becomes the invisible architecture of every relationship, every negotiation, every social exchange they will ever have. By the time this is over, you will understand exactly why the way you think about yourself determines how everyone around you treats you, what the specific mental shifts look like that begin to change that dynamic permanently, and why the people you most admire in any room have not achieved what they carry by accident. They built it from the inside out, deliberately, one thought at a time. Before we go any further, stop for a second and do something important. If something in what you just heard touched a nerve, if you felt that first paragraph somewhere real, hit the like button right now, because this kind of video only reaches the people who need it when you tell the platform it is worth sharing. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because everything on this channel is built for people who are done with surface-level advice and ready for the psychology that actually changes how they live. And here's something this channel genuinely wants to know. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city and the time it is there right now. Are you in Birmingham at 10:30 at night, finally getting a quiet moment after a long day? Are you in Toronto at 6 in the morning before the rest of the house wakes up, stealing an hour to work on yourself before the world takes its share of you? Are you in Sydney, in Houston, in Nairobi, in Lagos? Every single person in this community arrived here from somewhere, and at some specific time in their life, and that moment matters. Tell us where you are. Tell us what time it is. You are not watching this alone. Here is what is actually happening beneath the surface of every social interaction you have ever had, and once you see this, you cannot unsee it, which is both the gift and the burden of understanding how human perception really works. When you walk into a room, people are not consciously assessing you. They are not running a deliberate checklist, tallying your strengths against your weaknesses, weighing your credentials, forming a considered and rational verdict about your worth. What they are doing is something far faster and far more primal. They are picking up on the signal you are broadcasting, a signal composed entirely of unconscious cues. The pace of your walk, the steadiness of your gaze, the way your voice finds its volume or shrinks from it, the posture your body defaults to when no one has reminded you to stand up straight, the split-second decisions you make about how much physical space to occupy and how long to hold eye contact before looking away. None of this is deliberate on your part. All of it is communication. Research published in peer-reviewed behavioral science journals establishes this with uncomfortable clarity. The way you perceive your own social status, your internal sense of where you sit in the hierarchy of any given room, directly and measurably affects the acoustic qualities of your voice, your facial expressions, your body posture, and the spatial behaviors through which you claim or surrender territory. Studies on vocal behavior found that individuals who rated themselves as socially dominant modulated their voices in ways that communicated that dominance to listeners. Lower pitch, steadier delivery, a pace that did not rush to fill silence. While individuals who perceived themselves as lower in the hierarchy showed precisely the opposite patterns, often raising pitch under social pressure, increasing their speech rate to avoid long silences, and shrinking the physical territory their bodies occupied. The world around you is not reacting to your resume. It is reacting to the living, breathing, continuously transmitted documentary of how you regard yourself. And that documentary runs whether or not you are aware it is filming. William Swan, professor of psychology at the University of Texas, spent decades studying what he called self-verification theory. The principle that people do not simply respond to how others treat them, they actively seek treatment that is consistent with how they see themselves, and they do this whether their self-view is positive or negative. His research showed something that most people find genuinely shocking when they first hear it, that people with negative self-concepts will actually work to undermine positive evaluations of themselves, will resist being seen as more capable or more worthy than their internal image allows, will sabotage the moments that contradict the story they have been telling themselves, not out of self-destruction, but out of the deep, ancient human need for consistency between the inner world and the outer one. This is not a rare pathology. This is the operating system of the vast majority of human beings who have never stopped to examine what they believe about themselves and why. The woman who has spent years being told she is too much will subtly push away the partner who finally treats her gently, because gentleness does not match the architecture of her self-concept, and the nervous system, deeply loyal to its own familiar patterns, finds dissonance more threatening than mistreatment. The man who grew up believing his contributions were unwelcome will downplay every idea he brings to a meeting before anyone has had a chance to receive it, doing the work of dismissing himself so efficiently that the room barely needs to participate in the dismissal at all. The adult who is made to feel invisible as a child will unconsciously position themselves in every new environment in a way that recreates the invisibility, standing a little outside the circle, speaking a little too quietly, waiting a little too long to assert themselves, and then experiencing the resulting invisibility as further confirmation of the old belief. The loop closing perfectly, the self-concept preserved intact. Charles Cooley, the American sociologist who coined the concept of the looking-glass self as far back as 1902, described the mechanism with a clarity that still holds over a century later, that as infants we scan our mother's face for clues about who we are, and that as adults we continue searching for our reflections in other people's eyes, using their reactions to confirm or update the story we carry about ourselves. The remarkable and somewhat troubling extension of that insight, validated by research published in Psychology Today examining metaperceptions, is that we filter those reflections through the self-concept we already hold, meaning we are not receiving the world's honest assessment of us. We are receiving our own story about ourselves, amplified and confirmed by our selective reading of every ambiguous social cue. In plain language, if you do not believe you deserve respect, you will unconsciously ensure you do not receive it. Not because life is unfair, because you are the one making the unconscious adjustments that guarantee the outcome confirms the belief. Robert Greene called this one of the most devastating and underexamined forces in human social dynamics. The self-opinion becoming a self-fulfilling architecture, the internal story becoming the external reality, the private belief becoming the public treatment, with no one deliberately orchestrating it, and everyone participating in it anyway. The person who has never examined this dynamic, and most people never do because examining it requires a courage that is harder than any external achievement, is the most recognizable person in any social environment. You can see the architecture of their self-story in everything they do, without needing them to tell you a word of it. Watch for the over-explainer. The person who cannot simply state their position and let it stand, who must immediately attach a qualification to every opinion, who says, "I might be wrong," but before an observation that is entirely correct, who preemptively apologizes for taking up intellectual space before they have even said the thing they wanted to say. What they believe they are doing is being humble. What they are actually doing is announcing to the room that they do not fully trust their own perceptions, that their views are tentative until ratified by someone else's agreement, and that their sense of standing in this conversation is conditional on the approval of people who were not, a moment ago, thinking about them at all. Then there is the validator seeker, the person who tells you good news about themselves and then immediately watches your face to see how you receive it, who cannot let an accomplishment simply be an accomplishment, but must see it reflected back approvingly in your eyes before they fully believe it happened, who uses other people's enthusiasm as the fuel that powers their own. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be seen, but there is a critical difference between sharing your life with people who matter to you and requiring their response in order to feel that your life is real. That difference, invisible from the outside, determines the entire quality of every close relationship you will ever have. And then there is the person who shrinks when challenged. Not the person who reconsiders when presented with genuine new evidence, that is intelligence, but the person who abandons their position the moment someone pushes back, not because they have been persuaded, but because the discomfort of disagreement exceeds the value they place on their own perspective. This person will tell you they are being open-minded. What their nervous system is actually doing is prioritizing peace with others over peace with themselves, and the price of that trade, paid in small installments over a lifetime, is the slow but complete erosion of any real sense of who they are. Robert Greene observed this pattern with precision across the historical figures he studied for decades. The distinction between people who were shaped by external opinion and people who had built an internal foundation solid enough to hold their identity in place when the world pushed against it. The ones who shaped history, who commanded rooms and built lasting legacies, were not the ones who were free from self-doubt. They were the ones who had developed enough internal authority to act in spite of it, to engage with the world from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Every single weakness in the way people treat you traces back to a weakness in the story you are running about yourself. This is not blame. This is architecture, and architecture can be changed. The first shift, and this is the one that changes everything downstream, the one without which nothing else will hold, is moving your sense of worth off the market. Most people, without ever examining this choice, have placed their self-worth in a publicly traded position. It goes up when people approve. It goes down when people criticize. It fluctuates based on how a conversation landed, how many likes a post got, how warmly someone greeted them, whether the room seemed to take them seriously. This is an exhausting way to live, and it is invisible to the person living it because it feels like simply paying attention to the world, like being appropriately responsive to feedback, like caring about quality and connection. But what it actually is, structurally, is a daily referendum on your own value with everyone around you casting votes. And here is what that daily referendum costs, beyond the exhaustion. It costs you the kind of presence that makes people want to be around you. Because there is a quality that is universally attractive across every culture, every age group, every social context. And it is the quality of self-possession, of a person who is fully in the room without needing the room to validate their right to be there. That quality cannot be performed. It can only be the natural outward expression of someone whose worth is genuinely not contingent on what any particular person in any particular moment decides about them. And the cruelest part of the approval-seeking dynamic is that the very behavior designed to secure approval, the attentiveness to every micro-reaction, the constant calibration of self-presentation to match what seems wanted, communicates the exact opposite of the solidity that actually generates approval. People are drawn to those who seem to need their approval least, not because human beings are perverse, but because the person who does not need your approval is implicitly communicating that they have something worth not needing it for. an internal world rich and stable enough to sustain them without your contribution. The research on self-determination theory, the framework developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, that has been validated across cultures and decades of study, draws a precise line between people whose sense of well-being is driven by intrinsic motivation, behavior rooted in their own values, curiosity, and internal standards, and people whose well-being depends on extrinsic conditions, approval, recognition, performance metrics, other people's reactions. The research is consistent and unambiguous. People operating from intrinsic motivation show greater psychological stability, greater resilience under pressure, deeper and more durable relationships, and a significantly stronger capacity to sustain effort on things that matter to them over time. The reason is simple. When your worth is internally sourced, it cannot be revoked by any external event. When it is externally sourced, it is perpetually vulnerable to every wind of opinion in every room you enter. Robert Greene was explicit about this in The Laws of Human Nature when he wrote that your sense of self-worth comes from within, not from without. Not as a motivational phrase, as an architectural observation, that the people who project genuine authority, who command genuine respect, who are genuinely difficult to manipulate or diminish or rattle, are the people who have genuinely relocated the source of their self-regard to a place no external force can reach, and that the people who perform confidence, who perform success, who perform contentment, are legible as performances to everyone paying attention, because the performance has a different quality than the real thing, a slightly too eager quality, a quality of seeking rather than having, and human beings evolve to detect that difference before they are consciously aware they are detecting anything at all. Research on chronic validation seeking published through clinical psychology frameworks establishes this at the neural level, that without self-acceptance as a genuine internal foundation, beneficial practices like mindfulness become less effective at reducing stress, and brain regions responsible for emotional regulation actually show reduced gray matter density, meaning that the person who is perpetually scanning the environment for approval is not just emotionally depleted, they are neurologically compromised in their capacity to regulate the very emotional states that make the scanning feel so urgent in the first place. The cycle feeds itself. The treatment for the cycle is not more approval. It is the slow, deliberate withdrawal of your own worth from the market. The decision, made once and then remade every day until it stops needing to be made, that what you think of yourself is not up for public vote. What this means in practice is this. The moment you stop needing any particular person to respond to you in any particular way, the moment the warmth of someone's approval becomes genuinely nice rather than secretly necessary, the entire dynamic of that interaction shifts, because you are no longer negotiating from a position of need, you are engaging from a position of presence. And presence is the thing people cannot manufacture, cannot fake for long, and cannot help being drawn toward when they encounter it in someone else. The second shift is learning to think about yourself in terms of what you are becoming rather than what you have failed to become. And this distinction, which sounds like it belongs on a motivational poster until you understand the actual psychology underneath it, is one of the most functionally powerful reframes available in human cognition. Most people maintain a permanent internal trial in which they are the defendant. The prosecution makes a case from every failure, every embarrassment, every moment they were too slow or too cautious or too afraid or too much or not enough. Every piece of evidence the past has generated that confirms the story the critic inside them has been building since childhood. The defense rarely gets a word in. The verdict, delivered quietly and repeatedly, is some variation of not quite good enough, and that verdict becomes the self-opinion that shapes the broadcast, that shapes the treatment, that confirms the verdict. A 2014 study from the University of Michigan found that people tend to view themselves more negatively than others actually view them. The internal trial is running in a court that no one else has access to, prosecuting with evidence that other people either never witnessed or long since stopped caring about, holding the defendant to a standard of retrospective perfection that would disqualify every human being who has ever lived. And while this trial is running, while you are busy being your own harshest critic, building the case against your own worthiness. The people around you are, in most cases, barely thinking about you at all. That is not a comforting thing to hear, but it is a freeing one. The audience for your worst self-assessments is almost entirely you. The elaborate prosecution you've been running for years against your own character is taking place in a courtroom where you are simultaneously judge, jury, prosecutor, and defendant, and the gallery is largely empty, because other people are running their own internal trials and do not have the bandwidth to be as invested in yours as you have assumed. Thomas Gilovich, psychologist at Cornell University, put it this way: "We are so close to our own behavior and so aware of our own thoughts that it is hard to be objective. The access we have to our own internal monologue is a perspective no one else shares. We hear every doubt we ever had about ourselves. We remember every awkward moment with the high-definition clarity that emotionally significant memories encode. We carry our history in a way other people simply do not carry it about us. And the result is that we present ourselves to the world with the weight of that entire history pressing down on us, while the world is meeting us fresh in this moment, without the file folder of accumulated evidence we have spent years compiling against ourselves." Psychology Today, in research examining what psychologists call meta-perceptions, the study of how accurately we sense what others think of us, found that people filter the cues they receive from others through their existing self-concept, meaning that if you go into a room believing you are not particularly impressive, you will unconsciously read every ambiguous social signal as confirmation of that belief. The person who glanced at their phone during your story becoming evidence that you are boring. The colleague who did not laugh at your joke becoming evidence that you are not funny. The moment of silence after you spoke becoming evidence that you said the wrong thing, when none of those things necessarily meant any of that, and a person entering the same room with a different self-concept would read the same signals entirely differently. The thought that changes this is not a positive affirmation. Positive affirmations tell you to replace the prosecution's evidence with a counter-narrative before you have built the internal foundation to hold that counter-narrative in place. And what happens is that the affirmation sits on top of the unexamined belief like a coat of paint over a crack. It looks different for a while, and then the crack shows through again. The thought that actually changes things is the honest, sustained, long-term commitment to evaluating yourself by what you are working toward, rather than what you have already arrived at. Understanding that the version of you that exists right now is not the verdict on your worth, but one point in a trajectory. That the trajectory is the thing that matters, and the trajectory is the thing you control. And that beginning to think this way consistently and deliberately is the beginning of a broadcast that the world around you will start to receive differently, not because you told them to, but because the signal itself has changed. The third shift is the one Robert Greene would call learning to master your own script. And it is, in his framework, the one that distinguishes the person who is authored from the person who is merely narrated, the person who decides how they will be defined from the person who allows life's accumulated experiences to define them by default. Every person carries a script, a story about who they are, how the world works, what they are capable of, and what they deserve. For most people, that script was written by other people, by a parent who said you were too sensitive, a teacher who said you were not academic enough, a relationship that ended in a way that you interpreted as evidence of your fundamental unlovability, a failure that you took as proof of a limitation, rather than as data about a specific attempt at a specific time. The script was handed to you piece by piece, and at some point, without any formal ceremony of acceptance, you began treating it as biography, rather than as someone else's interpretation of you. Greene's core argument in The Laws of Human Nature is that you can take authorship back, not by denying the experiences that shaped the old script. Those experiences were real, and their weight should not be dismissed, but by refusing to let them function as prophecy, by understanding that what happened to you in the past is information about the past, and not a contract governing the future. By recognizing that the self-concept you currently hold is not the truth about who you are, but the conclusion of a narrative that was written largely by other people, under circumstances that are no longer the circumstances of your actual life. What taking authorship back looks like in practice is this. You stop describing yourself with the language of the old story. You stop saying, I am just not a confident person the way other people are, or I have always been like this, or that is just how I am. Because every time you say those words, you are reinforcing the architecture of a self-concept that does not serve you. You are voting for the old story with the authority of your own voice, and your voice carries more weight with your nervous system than any other voice in the world. You start describing yourself, first privately and then gradually in how you carry yourself publicly, as someone in the process of becoming something specific. Not someone who has already arrived at a perfected destination, that is performance, and it has the fragile quality of all performances. But someone who is committed to a direction, who knows what they are building, who brings that commitment into every room as a quiet, unannounced certainty that other people can feel even when they cannot name what they are feeling. The research on self-perception theory, developed by psychologist Daryl Bem, established something that seemed counterintuitive when it first emerged, and has since been validated across decades of behavioral research, that people infer their own attitudes and internal states partly by observing their own behavior, the same way they observe other people's behavior. This means the causal arrow runs both ways. You think, therefore you act, but also, you act, and then you think accordingly. The person who begins carrying themselves as though their opinion of a situation is worth stating will, over time, begin genuinely believing that their opinion is worth stating, not because they talk themselves into it intellectually, but because the repeated behavioral evidence has updated their internal model of who they are. Start with the behavior. The internal shift follows. There is a specific way the self-diminisher moves through the world that every person in this room has either done themselves or watched someone they love do. And naming it precisely is the first step to stopping it. The self-diminisher over-apologizes. Not for genuine mistakes, which is the appropriate and decent thing to do, but for existing, for having needs, for taking up space, for wanting things, for feeling things, for being inconvenienced by the inconvenience of others. They apologize the way other people breathe, constantly, automatically, with a frequency that makes it clear the apology is not really addressed to the person in front of them, but to some interior judge whose standards they have never once managed to meet. And every apology, every sorry for existing, every reflexive diminishment of their own needs before anyone asks them to diminish anything, every one of those gestures sends a precise signal to everyone around them, a signal that says, I have already decided I am less than, and I am offering you the evidence before you have to ask for it. The approval seeker makes the world's reaction to them the primary instrument of their own internal navigation. They adjust their opinions based on the temperature of the room. They swallow the thing they were going to say when they sense it might not land the way they hoped. They scan faces after speaking for confirmation that they landed correctly. And when they do not find it, they spiral quietly into a reevaluation of whether they should have spoken at all. And the devastating irony of this, the irony that Greene would point to immediately, is that the approval-seeking behavior produces the very opposite of the response it is chasing. Needing approval communicates an absence of internal authority, and absence of internal authority is the least appealing thing in any social hierarchy, because authority does not flow toward need. It flows toward solidity, toward the person who is not asking the room for permission to be who they are. The unconscious broadcaster has never once stopped to examine what they believe about themselves and what signal those beliefs are generating, because they have been told their entire lives that self-examination is the province of people with too much time on their hands, that confidence is something you either have or you do not, that the way you are is simply who you are. This person is walking through life operating on psychological software written by everyone except themselves, producing outcomes they do not understand, and experiencing a chronic low-level confusion about why other people seem to move through the world with an ease that feels permanently unavailable to them. What all three of these people have in common, and what makes the difference between where they are and where the self-authored person stands, is not talent, not circumstances, not luck. It is the story that is running inside, and the story that is running inside is not fixed. Building a new internal story, one that produces a different broadcast and therefore a different world, is not a single decision. It is a daily practice, and the practice has specific mechanics that make it real rather than wishful. The first mechanic is the honest audit. You take the beliefs you are currently carrying about yourself, not the ones you publicly claim, but the ones that run in the background when you are alone, when you are about to speak up and something stops you, when you are assessing your own value in a room, and you examine where each one came from, not to forgive or to process in the therapeutic sense, but to evaluate it as information. To ask, is this belief based on actual, current evidence? Or is it based on a conclusion I drew from an experience that happened at a different time in my life, to a different version of me, in circumstances that no longer apply? Most beliefs that limit people fail this test. They are old data, treated as permanent truth, carrying authority they no longer deserve. Robert Greene made this point with the precision of someone who had studied hundreds of historical figures across decades of research. That the most dangerous stories people carry are not the obviously false ones, but the ones that were once true, the ones that earned their place in the self-concept at a particular moment in time, and then simply stayed past their expiration, continuing to operate as instructions for the present, long after the present had moved past the conditions that made them relevant. The child who learned that speaking up led to humiliation grows into an adult who stays quiet in meetings not because speaking up currently leads to humiliation, but because the nervous system never received the update that the old environment no longer exists. The teenager who was rejected when they showed ambition becomes the adult who downplays their goals before anyone has had a chance to dismiss them. The person who was betrayed when they trusted too openly becomes the one who holds everyone at arm's length, not because the person in front of them has given any reason for distance, but because the self-concept decided years ago that closeness is a risk the evidence does not support. The audit asks you to do something that takes more courage than most external achievements. To look at these beliefs directly, to name them honestly, and to ask with genuine curiosity whether they are serving the life you have now or the life you had then. The second mechanic is what Greene would call the cultivation of self-possession, the deliberate, repeated practice of acting from your own center rather than from the reaction of the room, of finishing your sentences rather than trailing off when you sense uncertainty in the listener, of holding your position when challenged rather than immediately accommodating the challenger, of letting a silence be a silence rather than rushing to fill it with reassurance that you are not as threatening as your competence might suggest. This is not aggression. It is not coldness. It is the quiet, steady practice of treating your own perspective as something worth occupying fully, which is the only way anyone else will ever treat it that way. The research on self-perception theory, developed by psychologist Daryl Bem, established something that seemed counterintuitive when it first emerged and has since been validated across decades of behavioral research, that people infer their own attitudes and internal states partly by observing their own behavior, the same way they observe other people's behavior. This means the causal arrow runs both ways. You think, therefore you act. But also, you act, and then you think accordingly. The person who begins carrying themselves as though their opinion of a situation is worth stating will, over time, begin genuinely believing that their opinion is worth stating, not because they talk themselves into it intellectually, but because the repeated behavioral evidence has updated their internal model of who they are. Start with the behavior. The internal shift follows. This is not self-manipulation. This is how the self actually builds itself, through the accumulation of actions that are slightly ahead of the belief, pulling the belief forward into territory it would never have entered on its own. The third mechanic is paying attention to the quality of your self-talk with the same seriousness you would pay to the quality of any other tool you rely on to do important work. Research on self-concept has established that the language people use internally to describe themselves directly shapes the behaviors that flow from that self-concept, which then produce the perceptions that confirm the self-concept, which then reinforce the language, a loop that runs continuously in one direction or the other. The person who begins, in the privacy of their own mind, to describe themselves with accuracy rather than with the prosecution's worst-case narrative, who begins to credit their own observations and trust their own perceptions and honor their own reactions rather than preemptively dismissing them, This person is not just feeling better, they are changing the signal. And changing the signal changes the world's response. Not eventually, not theoretically, not if conditions are favorable, but immediately and measurably, and in ways that other people notice before you do. Start small, and start today. The next time you are about to apologize for something you did not actually do wrong, notice the impulse, let it arrive, and choose not to act on it. Not with a speech about why you are not apologizing, just without the apology. Feel what happens in the room. Notice whether the disaster you were bracing for materializes. It almost never does. What materializes instead is the faint, unfamiliar sensation of having occupied your position without asking permission. And that sensation, small as it is the first data point in a new story about what is possible for you. The first time feels wrong. The second time feels less wrong. The 100th time feels like you. The next time you are in a room and you feel the pull to shrink, to make yourself a little quieter, to take up a little less space, to wait until you are more certain before you say the thing you already know. Notice it as a signal from the old story, not as information about the current situation. The old story is running its old program. The current situation is an open question. Answer it from where you are now, not from where you were told you were a long time ago. The next time you receive a compliment, let it stand. Do not immediately deflect it. Do not immediately qualify it. Do not perform humility at the expense of actually absorbing the information that someone saw something in you that was worth acknowledging. Say thank you. Mean it. Let the moment be what it is. This is smaller than it sounds and more significant than almost anything else you can do to begin shifting the deep structural belief that your worth is provisional rather than inherent. There will be days when the old story is louder than the new one. There will be moments when the approval-seeking reflex fires before you have had a chance to intercept it, when the broadcast you are sending is the old broadcast, when the room responds accordingly and your nervous system takes it as confirmation. Those moments are not evidence that nothing has changed. They are evidence that you are in the middle of changing, which is the only place change ever lives. The person who stays with it past those moments is the person who eventually stops having those moments. The person who decides the moments are proof the project was always hopeless is the person who hands the old story its victory. Stay with it. That version of you who has been shrinking, who has been over-explaining and over-apologizing and scanning faces for permission and treating their own perspective as a proposal subject to the world's approval. That version has served a function. It kept you safe in environments where smallness was the less painful option. It kept the peace in rooms where your full presence felt threatening to people who needed you to be less than you were. It was not weakness. It was adaptation, and the intelligence it took to learn that adaptation, to read those environments accurately, to know instinctively what the room could and could not hold. That intelligence does not go away when the old pattern does. It gets redirected. It becomes the same perceptiveness applied to building something new rather than to maintaining something old. But you are not in those rooms anymore. And the adaptation that kept you safe there has become the thing that keeps you small here, in a life that is asking something different of you, in a world that will give you back exactly what you broadcast, in rooms where the most valuable thing you can bring is not compliance or performance or the relentless management of other people's comfort. It is the full, unedited, undiminished signal of a person who has decided what they are worth and stopped waiting for the world's permission to live accordingly. The self-authored person does not walk into a room demanding to be seen. They walk in already whole. People sense that before anything is said, before a single credential is established or a single achievement mentioned, before the social currency of status has been counted or distributed. They sense it in the way the space around this person feels. Not smaller, not competitive, not hungry, but settled, clear, and strangely, genuinely worth paying attention to. They sense it in the fact that this person's eyes do not move to the door the moment someone more important walks in. They sense it in the absence of that particular quality of performance that most people carry into most rooms. The quality of trying to be something rather than simply being someone. That is not a performance. That is what happens when the internal story has been rebuilt honestly, with the right material, by someone who finally decided to be the author. If something in this video hit you somewhere real, if you heard yourself in any of those patterns, if you recognized the broadcast you have been sending and felt something shift when you realized it does not have to stay that way, comment self-authored right now. Not because this channel needs the engagement, though it helps, because saying it publicly in front of people you do not know, in a community built for people who are done with the old story, is the first act of authorship. It is the moment you put your name on the new version. Subscribe and ring the bell. Every video on this channel is designed to give you the psychology that explains why your life looks the way it looks, and the practical understanding of how to change it, not as theory, but as something you can actually use, starting today, in the real rooms of your real life. And tell us where you are watching from, your city, the time it is right now where you are. Because someone is watching this at midnight in London, after a day that cost them something, and someone else is watching at dawn in Dallas before the day has asked anything of them yet, and someone in Auckland and Lagos and Toronto and Glasgow is reading this and thinking something close to what you are thinking, that they are done with the old story. Say where you are. Say what time it is. Let this community know you were here. Go forth and be self-authored.